Welcome back to the deep dive. When we talk about civilization, we often get caught up in the tangible things, GDP figures, political systems, military power. But if you actually peel back all those visible layers, every single civilization, it rests on something far more fundamental. It rests on a shared story it tells about itself.
That's right.
What sustains it, what gives it moral direction, collective coherence, and that crucial, indispensable sense of meaning. If you lose that underlying symbolic architecture, everything else just starts to rattle. And that, I think, fundamentally is the urgent question facing the contemporary West right now.
It truly is the foundation of foundations. And to really understand our current moment, we have to look back at the historical anchor.
Okay.
For well over 1,000 years, that symbolic architecture was provided by a deeply ingrained Christian metaphysical framework. This wasn't just a choice of faith for a few people.
No, it was everything.
It was the operating system for the West. It shaped our institutions, our concepts of law, our understanding of human dignity, and critically, even how we conceptualize time itself. It was the ultimate lens.
So our mission today is to unpack this slow, multi-generational erosion of this foundation. And we're not talking about a quick political upheaval, the kind of thing that happens in a single generation.
Right.
We're looking at a process driven by forces that are now so ambient they feel almost invisible. Scientific rationalism, the rise of technocratic governance, and the spread of secular humanism. And we're going to compare two vastly distinct paths to dechristianization. One that failed violently in the 18th century, and one that has, well, quite subtly succeeded in the modern era.
And that comparison is absolutely critical because it illuminates the symbolic dynamics at play. The contemporary shift, the one unfolding since, say, the mid-20th century, it appears far more durable than any past attempts.
Why is that?
Precisely because of its slow and diffuse nature. It never triggered the kind of full-scale conflict that the earlier attempt did. But that very success, that durability, paradoxically, introduces new and profound forms of instability.
So we're in a strange position.
We are now definitively at a civilizational crossroads. We're navigating the consequences of moving away from a central unifying narrative without a clear, comprehensive, and shared replacement. We're sort of in a state of suspension.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's begin with the violent, abrupt case study, the French Revolution. Because if you want to understand how not to change a civilization's spiritual fabric, you start there.
It's a masterclass in failure by haste. The French Revolution is just the most concentrated, the most state-driven effort in Western history to dismantle a symbolic order by sheer force and legislative decree.
And the leaders, the Jacobins, they got this, didn't they? They understood that political liberation, that wasn't enough.
Oh, they understood it completely. For them, ending the monarchy, establishing the republic, that was all incomplete without metaphysical liberation. They argued the old worldview had to be totally uprooted for the new republican man to truly emerge.
They didn't just target the king or the aristocrats. They went straight for the deepest, most foundational structure they could find.
Time itself.
The entire conception of time. It wasn't enough to close the churches. They wanted to redefine the rhythm of daily life, the calendar, the very memory of sacred history. Why start there? Why was the calendar the first symbolic battlefield?
Because time, within that Christian framework, it's not a neutral sequence of moments. It's a structured narrative. It points toward creation, revelation, redemption, every Sunday, every saint's day, every holiday.
They're all anchors in that story.
Exactly. They are anchors in that narrative. So the revolutionary attempt to abolish the 7-day week and Sundays, that wasn't just a trivial adjustment for efficiency. It was a profound ideological intervention designed to sever the populace from those Christian rhythms.
And what they replaced it with, this new 10-day decade. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was deliberately anti-religious.
Deeply. The idea being that workers now got a day of rest less frequently, every 10 days instead of every 7, and it specifically broke the continuity of the ancient Sabbath tradition that ran through both Judaism and Christianity.
It was an act of pure temporal engineering.
That's a great way to put it. They were trying to force a new habit, a new rhythm, entirely disconnected from the transcendent. And the confusion it caused in a predominantly rural agricultural society was just immense.
I can't even imagine.
Well, imagine trying to coordinate markets or planting or social life when centuries of temporal expectation are suddenly replaced by this confusing, mathematically imposed schedule that has no connection to shared custom or belief.
And it wasn't just the structure of the week, was it? They went after the months, too.
Oh, yes. They renamed the months Thermidor, Brumaire, Fructidor, moving away entirely from historical saints and religious festivals.
And grounding society in what
Yeah.
nature?
In nature, agriculture, and pure reason. It was an attempt to make the cycle of the year purely materialist and, anthropocentric, human-centered.
And then the ultimate symbolic reset, declaring 1792 as year one.
That act just symbolically wiped the slate clean. It wasn't just them saying, we're starting a new government. They were saying, we are starting a new history.
Wow.
They positioned the revolution itself, a political act, as the true redemptive beginning of human freedom. The profound insight here, and this is what makes it so instructive, is that the leaders understood that if you want to change a civilization's metaphysical orientation,
You have to change its calendar.
you have to. Because Christian time was never just a neutral background. It encoded the entire worldview.
And yet the new calendar was confusing, it was
Yeah.
deeply unpopular, and ultimately, it failed.
It failed spectacularly.
It just reveals how profoundly embedded those temporal structures were, doesn't it? You can't just replace centuries of shared sacred rhythm backed by spiritual belief with a bureaucratic schedule overnight.
The body politic just rejected it, like a bad organ transplant.
And this led them to the next phase, right? The physical and public campaign.
Absolutely. The outright elimination of Christianity from public life.
Yeah.
And the scope was truly radical. Churches were seized, closed, or actively repurposed as, temples to new state gods.
Right, the temples of reason.
Exactly. Religious symbols were publicly destroyed. Public worship was banned. We often read this as just an anti-clerical movement driven by political power struggles. But fundamentally, it was a metaphysical operation.
I think we need to dwell on that metaphysical aspect for a moment. Why was transcendence itself, the very idea of it, seen as a political threat?
Because the revolutionary leaders, especially the really hardcore ones, they viewed Christianity as fundamentally incompatible with Republican virtue. The moment an individual or a community orients their loyalty toward a transcendent authority toward God rather than the state,
You have a conflict.
you have a conflict of ultimate sovereignty. The church represented an alternative sovereignty. If God dictated the moral law, then the state could not monopolize moral authority. The state sought to replace the church's role entirely.
As the interpreter of meaning.
And the guardian of collective memory. They believed political transformation absolutely required spiritual transformation. Otherwise, the old loyalties would just undermine the new system from within.
That's such a deep insight. The state just couldn't tolerate competition for the ultimate source of truth.
Not at all.
But history shows us, right, that you cannot have a vacuum where the sacred used to be. Human societies seem programmed to find a sacred center. So in their zeal to destroy the old, the revolutionaries, they just ended up having to nationalize religion.
They attempted to install a new sacred center through these immediate state-sponsored religions. They tried the explicitly anti-theistic cult of reason, which celebrated human rationality and knowledge as the new divine focus.
And how did that go over?
It was too cold, too abstract for the masses. So then Robespierre tried to pivot with the cult of the supreme being.
Which was more deistic.
Yes, a deistic moral framework. Essentially a politically useful God that validated civic virtue and national morality without all the inconvenient Christian theology.
And these were not subtle intellectual exercises. They had all the symbolic trappings.
Oh, completely. Massive, meticulously orchestrated public festivals, new rituals, new hymns, new ceremonies, all explicitly redirected toward the Republic itself and its leaders.
It was an aggressive attempt to recast the image of the divine.
Into the human. That's
Okay.
it, exactly. They replaced the Christian God with an intensely anthropocentric ideal, the rational, virtuous citizen. The sacred was essentially reimagined as human moral purity, civic virtue, and collective sovereignty.
And you see this climax in Robespierre's dramatic festival of the Supreme Being in 1794.
Yes, where he stages the Republic as this transcendent moral force, essentially making the people and their collective political will the embodiment of the sacred.
That shift from a focus on the divine to a focus on humanity and human reason, that feels like the real legacy of the revolution, even though this part of it failed.
It absolutely foreshadowed the modern belief that human reason, rather than divine revelation, is the ultimate source of legitimacy and moral clarity.
But the immediate project, it just collapsed.
Dramatically. Despite all the action, the calendar change, the cults, the destruction of symbols, the terror, the attempt to enforce this new metaphysics failed within a decade.
Why fundamentally? Was it purely because of the speed?
Speed was the killer. It attempted to replace a symbolic order that had been evolving and deepening its roots for 1,500 years almost instantly. The civic religions they manufactured,
They feel fake.
they lacked emotional resonance, they lacked historical depth, and they lacked generational transmission. They felt artificial and cold.
And crucially, the suppression of religious practice alienated the vast majority of the population, especially in rural areas like the Vendée, leading to open counter-revolution.
Absolutely. The failure demonstrates a crucial lesson for our discussion today. Civilizational metaphysics cannot be replaced by decree or state terror alone. They require generational transmission, cultural continuity, and deep symbolic power elements. The revolution simply couldn't manufacture fast enough.
It was an abrupt surgical rupture.
And society's cultural immune system rejected it violently. That led to political instability and, eventually, a return to many traditional forms under Napoleon.
That failure sets the stage perfectly for our analysis of the modern West. The French Revolution tried the hard, violent, abrupt way and failed. The modern West tried the subtle way, the slow way, using culture and institutions.
And that, arguably, is precisely why it's succeeding in creating a durable secular framework.
So if force failed in 1789, what cultural tool did the modern West use to achieve the same end without triggering that backlash? Here's where it gets really interesting. We are now shifting from the 18th century rupture to the slow, multi-generational metamorphosis of the modern West. And the key difference is that this process was gradual, diffuse, and crucially largely uncoordinated by any central government.
Yes.
It unfolded over nearly a century, operating primarily through these cultural engines like universities, media, and technology.
This contrast is paramount. If the French Revolution was a high fever that the body immediately fought off with massive resistance, the modern shift. It was like a slow change in ambient pressure and temperature.
One that the culture gradually acclimatized to.
Exactly. Without even noticing it was happening, it successfully bypassed the cultural immune response that killed the revolution. And we can really break this slow erosion down into 4 critical phases.
Okay, let's start with the first phase. Post-war technocracy and the rise of scientific authority right after World War II. After the absolute horrors of 2 ideological world wars, people were desperate for stability and objectivity. Where did they look?
They looked away from ideological or theological certainties and towards scientific expertise, bureaucratic management, and technological progress. Rationality, objectivity, data-driven decisions. These were seen as the definitive antidote to ideological extremism and chaos.
And this wasn't just, public opinion. This drove massive institutional restructuring.
Oh, completely.
We're talking about the explosion of the administrative state in the 1950s and 60s, expanding agencies all dedicated to efficiency and measurement. But what was the specific impact on the academic world, the great engine of cultural production?
Well, the shift in the universities was tectonic. Before the war, many leading universities, even the secular ones, still retained strong departments in classical learning, philosophy, theology as integral parts of the curriculum. After World War II, driven by massive federal funding, think of agencies like the National Science Foundation in the U.S., they dramatically prioritized funding for empirical research, engineering, and the hard sciences. The university system grew into these enormous federally funded research institutions.
So the money followed the measurable. Applied science got the funding, and the humanities or theology often got relegated to the academic margins.
Precisely. And the result was that scientific knowledge became the primary state-sanctioned source of public legitimacy. This was the first decisive shift in authority. It replaced the church, the traditional interpreter of divine truth, with the university and the laboratory, the interpreter of empirical truth.
So the authority shifted from a theological interpretation
to technocratic management. This laid the foundation for a world where, in a sense, only the measurable is considered truly real or legitimate.
But pure technocracy can feel cold, can't it? It's the next phase, the cultural revolutions of the 1960s, that brought the required passion and the individual focus to this metamorphosis.
That's right.
We saw simultaneous eruptions across the board. Civil rights, the anti-war movement, feminism, the sexual revolution, the counterculture.
And while those movements had wildly specific political and social aims, they collectively shared an underlying philosophical commonality.
Which was?
A profound and successful challenge to inherited traditional authority structures, and that very much included religious ones. The core moral emphasis moved dramatically away from communal frameworks enforced by the church or tradition and toward personal autonomy, self-expression, and liberation from inherited social norms.
That's the key. In the previous Christian worldview, meaning was found externally in a transcendent God, in a shared moral law and duty to community. The 1960s movement successfully argued that the self must be liberated from those external constraints.
Exactly. The self became the new primary locus of meaning. Meaning was no longer inherited, but discovered or constructed internally through personal experience and identity formation.
And this was a direct metaphysical counterpoint to the old system.
It was. And because it was wrapped up in movements for genuine social justice and liberation, it was immensely powerful and attractive, especially to the young generation who would soon go on to staff the very institutions we're talking about.
This shift fundamentally redefined what the human person is, and that laid the groundwork for our third and perhaps most durable phase, institutional secularization, roughly spanning the 1970s through the 1990s.
Yeah.
This is where the diffuse agents of change, the universities, Hollywood, the media, really consolidated power and began encoding these new assumptions into the cultural DNA.
And this consolidation was subtle but absolute. These institutions began to operate on the assumption that the Christian metaphysical framework was, at best, a historical artifact, and at worst, an oppressive structure designed to inhibit personal autonomy.
Let's focus on that substitution you mentioned. You argue that psychology replaced theology as the dominant framework for understanding the self. Can you elaborate on how that actually works on a daily cultural level?
It's a complete reframing of morality. The classic theological framework dealt with concepts like sin, virtue, duty, spiritual responsibility. The psychological framework replaces these with concepts like trauma, self-actualization, personal boundaries, and systemic dysfunction.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Consider the traditional concept of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. It's a moral failure rooted in an exaggerated sense of self-worth that harms one's relationship with God and community.
Okay, so how is that reframed today in the secular therapeutic model?
Well, today, it's almost never called pride. It's usually understood as a deficit, a lack of proper self-esteem, maybe a failure to validate one's true identity, or perhaps a defense mechanism against past trauma.
So the solution changes completely.
Completely. In the past, the solution was confession, repentance, self-discipline, a moral and spiritual endeavor. Today, the solution is therapy, self-help, boundary setting, a technical or psychological endeavor aimed at optimizing the self for subjective well-being.
So moral questions are reframed not in terms of objective good and evil derived from a transcendent source.
But in therapeutic or scientific terms, as issues of mental health or systemic problems or subjective psychological fulfillment, it removes the need for a spiritual authority entirely and replaces it with an expert class of psychological managers.
And that is the new metaphysics being established.
Precisely. The human person is seen primarily as a psychological subject to be optimized for happiness and functionality, not a spiritual being with a transcendent destiny defined by duty or shared moral law.
And the media Hollywood is the perfect example, acted as the great transmission belt for these assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the shift in narrative arcs you see in films. From stories of heroic duty and sacrifice, which were often religiously inflected, to stories of personal psychological liberation and self-discovery. That's the dominant story now.
It's the constant drip. Every show, every film, every academic textbook, and increasingly every HR manual reinforces a world where religious literacy just plummets. And the default setting for moral dilemmas is secular humanism or psychological self-optimization.
It was not imposed by a guillotine.
Yeah.
It was absorbed through cultural consumption and elite education, making it feel utterly normal.
Which brings us to the present moment, the fourth phase, the technocratic metaphysics of the 21st century. With the digital revolution and the dominance of data, the arbiters of truth have become even more abstract, impersonal, and quantifiable.
Data, algorithms, artificial intelligence, expert global institutions.
These are the modern oracles.
They are. These abstract systems are now the structures that shape public discourse, determine validity, and define reality. Identity itself, which was once rooted in spiritual narratives or communal belonging, is now increasingly defined through quantifiable means.
As such as?
Bureaucratic categories, which box you in for administrative purposes, psychological diagnoses, which manage your internal state, or biological markers, which define your material existence. It's all about the measurable data point, not the transcendent soul.
So the new symbolic order is overwhelmingly grounded in scientific rationalism, administrative authority, and technological mediation. And this is why the modern shift is so much more durable than the French Revolution.
It's the speed or lack thereof that matters. These slow changes bypass cultural immune responses. A French farmer in 1793 could clearly identify the ideological threat to his faith and lifestyle.
Right, it was obvious.
It was obvious, but if a young person today is simply educated in a system where moral questions are predominantly discussed through a psychological or political lens, and all media reinforces individual autonomy over communal obligation, the shift feels ambient. It feels neutral.
And therefore largely irresistible. It's not perceived as an ideology to be fought. It's simply perceived as reality.
It's just the operating assumptions of the modern world. That allowed the new assumptions to be baked right into the cultural DNA without ever triggering that massive, violent backlash that doomed the French experiment.
That durability is the success story of the secular metamorphosis.
And that success and durability is exactly why we must now confront the destabilizing consequences. Because we achieved coherence in one domain, the scientific, by shattering coherence in another, the moral and spiritual.
So what does this all mean? We've established that the modern subtle shift is durable, but you argue it is also profoundly destabilizing. Where does that instability come from?
It comes from the fact that Christianity, for all its immense historical complexity and human faults, provided three interlocking things that scientific rationalism fundamentally cannot.
Which are?
Moral coherence, a unified narrative of the self, and a shared sacred narrative that transcended local interests. Scientific rationalism is incredibly powerful as a method. It describes the world with unparalleled accuracy and efficiency, but it cannot fulfill these essential symbolic functions.
This is the critical issue of the sacred vacuum. We've built these technocratic systems that are brilliant at managing complexity, providing data, and optimizing efficiency, but they are utterly mute when asked the fundamental existential questions of existence.
Precisely. Science can tell us how the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, and it can help us live longer, more comfortable lives. But as a method, it cannot and does not provide meaning, purpose, moral orientation, or a shared vision of the good life.
It only tells us what is.
It never tells us what ought to be or why we are here. When the unifying religious narrative is removed, those questions don't just disappear, they simply flood the open space, and they get answered in fragmented and often mutually conflicting ways.
That sounds like a formula for fragmentation. And that leads directly to our first major consequence, the loss of a shared sacred narrative.
Without a single overarching story that defines the collective purpose, establishes a common moral baseline, and defines the ultimate destiny of humanity, the cultural landscape just necessarily fragments into smaller, competing meaning systems.
And we see the rise of these substitute narratives that try to fill that void.
All the time. Hyperpolarized political narratives, intensely specialized psychological self-help movements, or, these utopian technological narratives that promise salvation through transhumanism or data optimization.
But the key difference is that none of these competing narratives command the shared collective loyalty or the metaphysical authority that the previous Christian framework did.
No, they're all niche, they're relative, or they're constantly shifting. And this fragmentation, it filters right down to the individual level, creating our second critical consequence: identity fragmentation and polarization.
How so?
Well, the old religious identity, which defined personhood through the lens of moral duties, divine relationship, and community responsibility, has largely been dissolved. So individuals now must construct their own identity from scratch.
And they use the remaining available frameworks to do this: politics, lifestyle, personal psychology.
Exactly. And identity becomes this defensive, often aggressive construction. If my moral worth isn't rooted in a shared transcendent truth that applies to everyone, then it must be rooted in my immediate subjective political alignment or my diagnosed psychological state or my unique preferences.
So the shift is from being someone defined by a stable cosmology
To constructing a self defined by personal difference and subjective feeling.
And because these self-constructed identities are subjective, they are easily threatened, which produces the extreme cultural polarization we observe. We fight political battles over ideology, history, and social norms with a quasi-religious fervor. Why is that?
Because they are no longer just disputes over policy or economic distribution. They are disputes over the ultimate source of meaning and moral worth. When politics must fill the sacred vacuum, your political tribe becomes your metaphysical tribe.
The stakes become existential.
They do. You can't compromise, because to compromise is to invalidate your ultimate source of selfhood and meaning. The political arena, which was never designed to handle these metaphysical questions, just buckles under that pressure.
This is starting to sound profoundly unstable, which leads us to our third consequence: institutional instability. The shaking of the very structures we rely on, like governments and legal systems.
Many of our core Western institutions, from legal concepts like justice and natural rights to foundational human rights declarations like universal equality, were built either explicitly or implicitly on those now weakened Christian moral assumptions.
Things like universal human dignity.
Yes, the intrinsic worth of every individual, regardless of social status, moral accountability before a higher law, these are very, very hard to defend purely through scientific rationalism or bureaucratic utility. They require a metaphysical commitment.
So when the foundational metaphysical justification that guarantees universal equality, for instance, the concept that every person is created in the image of God is removed, the institutions built on that concept, they struggle to justify their moral commitments.
They lose their moral gravity. They become susceptible to being repurposed based on purely utilitarian metrics, or economic efficiency, or political power dynamics rather than moral principle.
The irony is immense.
It is. The technocratic state, designed for maximum rational stability and efficiency, relies entirely on the ghost of the old metaphysics to justify its fundamental moral commitments. When that ghost fades, the institutions start shaking because their inherent authority is undermined by the very rationalism that created them.
It's the ultimate double bind. We have the durability of the secular shift, meaning we are unlikely to revert to the old order, but we also have the instability of the vacuum, which means we can't unify around the new order.
Because the new order cannot speak to meaning or purpose.
Which is the state of suspension.
That's it. We are suspended between stories. The Christian narrative that provided coherence has been profoundly weakened by this gradual metamorphosis, replaced by psychologized selfhood and technocratic efficiency. But no equally comprehensive, emotionally resonant, and morally unifying alternative has emerged to fully replace it.
So we are masters of means, but completely uncertain of ends. We can manage, measure, and optimize, but we cannot agree on why we are managing or what moral purpose it all serves.
That is the precise definition of a civilizational crossroads. We are technologically advanced and bureaucratically managed, yet deeply uncertain, collectively fragmented, and morally directionless.
The slow erosion we discussed, the quiet dismantling of the calendar through cultural shifts rather than decrees, it obscured the radical nature of the change. It made the system durable, but the cost was this loss of shared meaning.
To synthesize our entire journey, the French Revolution taught us that you cannot achieve civilizational change through abrupt rupture. The cultural immune system is just too strong. The modern West, using diffuse agents like the university system, the mass media, and the therapeutic culture, achieved a durable secular metamorphosis because it normalized new assumptions over generations, effectively bypassing that resistance.
But the very gradualness that made the shift effective also obscured the profound consequence, the loss of the unifying narrative. We now possess incredibly powerful methods, science and technology, that excel at description, management, and optimization, but we have no widely accepted framework to answer the great questions of meaning, morality, and purpose.
And the result is clear. It's in the cultural fragmentation, the moral uncertainty, and the institutional instability that defines the current era. The slow, successful erosion has left us with a sacred vacuum that mere data or algorithms or subjective self-actualization cannot possibly fill. It is a moment of genuine, profound concern for the long-term coherence of the West.
The erosion of a sacred order, whether sudden and bloody, as in 18th century France, or gradual and quiet, as in the late 20th century West, is never just a social trend. It is a foundational civilizational event. And that leaves us with a critical open question for you, the listener, to consider as we stand here at this crossroad. Can the West construct a new symbolic architecture, a new shared sense of meaning that is emotionally resonant and morally unifying, capable of sustaining its social and moral life? Or are we destined to remain perpetually suspended between stories, borrowing coherence from a past we no longer genuinely believe in? That is the challenge of our vacuum.